One of the things that I've discovered taking people around the tour, which I know some of you have been on either today or in the past, or have looked around the display that we've got here at Oldham, one of the things that we've discovered is people haven't really thought about what happened after the emancipation of slaves, which happened legally on the 31st of July 1838. People often don't stop to think, well, what happened next? Of course, many of the slaves escaped as quickly as they could. Many had no choice but to remain on their plantations and continue working in appalling conditions. But one of the other stories that is very much forgotten is the people that were brought in to replace slaves, and these were labourers that were brought over from Asia. The Caribbean economy was totally dependent on sugar, and even before July 1838, the British government had organised a scheme to bring a new form of labour over to be ready to sort of take over. The scheme was initiated by John Gladstone, who was the father of William Gladstone, who later went on to be the Liberal Prime Minister, and we have an object belonging to John Gladstone just outside here at the beginning of the trail. He chartered 2 ships to bring labourers from Calcutta, and they arrived in May 1838. Less than 400 arrived, though more than 400 were recruited. The others died on the voyage over. He was assured by his recruiters in India that Indians have no religion, no education, and in their present state no wants beyond eating, drinking and sleeping, meaning that it was acceptable to dupe them into this system. Many were low-caste Indians who were living in appalling conditions already and were told that they might have an option of a better life, which they took. Others were kidnapped, and actually a British official described the system as an organised form of kidnap. People immediately were warning that not only could this lead to, in the words of the Secretary of State, a dreadful loss of life, but also to a new form of slavery. These labourers signed up to a fixed period. The system was, of course, very different to slavery. I'm not suggesting that it was the same at all, because it was a system of indenture, which meant that they did actually sign a contract to come over to the Caribbean, and they then were supposed to pay off their passage and were forced to save what money they had after paying off their passage to make sure that they would go home so they wouldn't be a burden on the colony. And then they were set to work processing sugar. The scheme was expanded across the Caribbean very quickly. Death rates were very high because of ill treatment, disease, poor acclimatisation, people dying of diseases that they weren't familiar with. And an abolition movement grew up around this as well. And the government warned, as they had done before, that if indenture was seized, the whole economy would collapse, just as they had argued that the economy would collapse if slavery was abolished. In fact, many of the labourers never did return home. The populations of particularly Guyana and Trinidad. Guyana was the first place where they were taken to. That's where John Gladstone owned his plantations in Demerara in Guyana. In fact, many of these labourers never returned home, and you can see that their descendants are still there, approximately sort of 50% Asian population of Trinidad and Guyana, but also across the Caribbean as well. One of the terrible consequences of indenture was not just the plight of the indentured labourers themselves, but of course they were brought in and took jobs that might otherwise have been taken by the newly freed slaves. And with this excess of labour in the Caribbean, this brought wages down, which set off another cycle of economic and social distress, really, and distorted the Caribbean economy even further. One of the reasons why indenture matters, I think, in the story of 1807 to 2007 is because it does undermine the British tendency to be triumphalist about abolition. And it does suggest that even though the British were very good at flying the flag for the sort of moral high ground that they had taken on abolishing slavery, at the very time they were still uprooting people, another group of people from their home, distorting their culture again and bringing them to a new situation of appalling distress and appalling treatment. And so I think this is something that's useful to remember when we're looking at the whole history of slavery and abolition. I'm just going to finish with a very short couple of minutes, just to bring up something that also is something that has surprised people on the trail, which is just a quick tell you the story of a couple of people, of black people who lived in Oldham in the 18th and 19th century. Because one of the things that we've discovered is people are very surprised to discover that there were black people in this area. That the kind of idea that black people only came over after the Second World War, the sort of Windrush generation, is still a very pervasive myth, I think. Here in Oldham, the first record that we know of as yet, and hopefully more will come to light, is of Juba Thomas, who I mentioned when Dominique mentioned it earlier, a man called Juba Thomas Royton, who was baptised on the 2nd of June 1760 in Royton, and was described as a Negro belonging to Thomas Percival, Esquire of Royton Hall, who was a wealthy linen merchant in Royton. We then have a record of his marriage to a white woman called Betty Mellor 5 years later, when he's described as a waiting man. Juba is interesting not only because he lives in Oldham, but because he appears to have kept an African name, which is very unusual, or he may have been given an African-sounding name, which is also possible. But of course, most slaves had their names taken away from them, straight very early on, and given names by their masters. So that is unusual. Secondly, the way he's described in the records raises quite interesting questions about the status of black people in Britain as a whole at that time, because he's originally described as belonging to his master, and then he's described as a waiting man. And it was a very kind of, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether people could be enslaved on British soil. There were lots and lots of test cases in the 18th century trying to deal with this issue. The most famous of which in 1772 made it illegal to take someone who had been enslaved, to take them from this country and force them to go back to the Caribbean to certain slavery. That was then illegal, though to actually possess a human being in Britain was still legal. But of course in Jude's case he may well have been given his freedom by his master anyway. We also have an intriguing photograph which is just outside, I don't know if people have seen it, of some black people on Royton Hall again. We have no idea whether they're any relation to Juba Thomas at all, and I was hoping that over the course of this year we would find out a little bit more about who they are, but nobody's come forward, so if anyone does find out anything about them, please do let us know. And then the other resident of the area that we have records for is James Johnson, who had been enslaved in the United States and had escaped, and his autobiography is in the collections at Local Studies and Archives, and you can go and read it there. He escaped to the north during the American Civil War, as many people did, and then worked his passage over to Liverpool and joined quite a large group of people, mostly men, who had been enslaved in the United States, escaped during the Civil War, and came over here to campaign for the abolition of American slavery. Yes, well, Johnson travelled around all over the place and ended up working for Platts, which of course was quite ironic because Platts was the biggest engineering firm in the world for producing textile machinery, which of course had grown out of the benefits of slavery. And that's where James Johnson ended up, in Oldham. And as I say, those records can be seen in Local Studies and Archives.